Explain to you what a Canada Research Chair is somewhat. 10, 15 years ago, the Canadian government decided with a splurge of generosity that it wanted to do something very, very important for research in the country. And so it was particularly concerned about the fact that, about the brain drain and the fact that we were losing people to other countries, which will not necessarily be named. And so they set up a very, very handsome funding of senior and then junior Canada Research Chairs. Now, the university, and so people would get, a lot of funding for the position itself and a lot of funding for research, which was highly valued in institutions. The universities responded immediately. They liked the money, but they recognized the problem that it posed. They were looking not so much at the brain drain to the States. Many universities were looking far more towards the danger that the universities with bigger pockets would be getting faculty, strong faculty, star-level faculty from universities that didn't quite have all of that funding. And so there were immediate internal negotiations. We've got to keep our stars, our real stars, but then within faculties, some kind of competition as to whose star really was going to deserve the money. And in this context, I just want to tell you that the first person that Carleton offered this to was Hymie Anisman. He was, without question, and it was accepted by all the different members of the different faculties. He was recognized immediately as the person who needed to get that particular offer. I happened to sit in on those somewhat contentious discussions and got to see some of the materials that were sent forward to talk about the various people. And people are not prophets in their own country, etc. But having read the various referees' comments was quite stunning. We heard that Hymie Anisman had done groundbreaking work in the ways in which stressful events could exacerbate the growth of an existing tumor. Who knew? And that he also did work showing the link between, and again, groundbreaking work showing the link between stress, immune functioning, and the development of depressive illnesses. And both of those apparently were really involved groundbreaking work that has then encouraged a lot of other people to do the same. Now, when I talk about the relationship between stress and then the development of depressive illness, you may then get a sense of what he brings to bear in all of this that is particularly interesting and important for us. That is, on the one hand, there is scientific work that's being grounded into the in his work in labs with mice and rats and other people that he can control, and then having to deal with, and then he's most concerned also with those beings that are much less easily controlled and brought into a lab, and that's human beings. He's very interested, and he's done very important work with Kim Matheson in terms of showing the social aspects. So when you see his list of publications, and I tried just to look at the titles, and there are a good 50 to 60% are unpronounceable. And then the rest have words in it that we can all relate to. And you will hear in this presentation the way he brings together those two areas in ways that sort of help to powerfully illuminate important phenomenon. And also not just to illuminate them, but to show as well their grounding in very hard research as well as their implications for all of us. So I bring you Hymie Anisman.
Sorry, I forgot. I wandered away. Amy Bombay, one of my graduate students, she's not here because she's giving a presentation, I think, in Hamilton. But much of the data was collected by her, and the second half of the talk will consider those data. And the first half of the talk, I'll talk primarily about stressors in general and the impact of these stressors on various pathological conditions. So before we get there, I'll give you a little bit about stress. Stress is probably the factor that produces more illness than any other variable. It may be that soon viral illnesses will exceed that, but at the moment it seems that stress is particularly profound in doing its job. Not all of us respond to the stressors in the same way, and not all of us will have the same illnesses. Stressors will induce a variety of neurochemical change, a variety of hormonal, neurotransmitter, immunological changes, and so forth. And the illness that one is affected by is determined by whatever weak link they have. So if your immune system is your weak link, you may end up with a stress-related pathology involving that system. And if your blood is coagulating in just the wrong ways, or you're building up blockages, well, then stress will affect your heart rather than your immune system, although, as you'll see later, the immune system and the heart are intricately connected. Another aspect about stress that's important to realize is that when a stress occurs and it induces a state such as depression, which is prone to do, this depression doesn't occur alone. Most illnesses, particularly psychiatric illnesses, appear as groups. Okay? We talk about this as comorbidity. Depression leads to, for example, heart disease, and heart disease in turn can also cause depressive types of illnesses. So it's not that I'm feeling bad and this feeling bad is stressful and this causes my heart to fail, but instead there seems to be a two-way communication, but more likely it's that they share some common element. So if your immune system goes awry and you have lots of inflammation in your body, even though you don't know this inflammation is present, okay, the inflammation may promote heart disease, but it may also promote depressive-like states. So we're often looking for these comorbidities that can give us clues as to what the common denominator might be, and thereby determine what mechanisms are responsible for the illness. So as you can see here, depression is associated with a large number of different types of pathologies, and again, the nature of the comorbidities that develop will be determined largely by what your chemical systems are like, as well as several other factors which we'll get to. Now, let me just take a bit of a detour. I feel like I'm trapped with this. Okay, I tend Stewart, who knew what my interests were, and so she introduced me to a topic that had been published about a year earlier. And this was a paper that was published by Steve Mayer, Marty Seligman, and Richard Solomon. And these guys had done this basic study that later became a classic in the area, and it was referred to as learned helplessness. In that paradigm, what they did was very straightforward. They took an animal, they tested it in a situation where it could escape from a stressor, some bad thing. Okay? And the animal, of course, does this very readily, just like your pet might do. Okay? If they took an animal and exposed it to a stressor first, an escapable stressor, something it could control, and then later put it in this new situation where it again could control the stressor, it escaped again very readily. If they, however, took the animal and placed it in a situation where control was not possible, there's nothing the animal could do to turn off the stressor. Okay? It went on at the same time as it did for the escapable animal, but for this guy, no control. When they later tested these animals, about 80%, not all of them, but about 80% showed severe behavioral disturbances. They would sit and accept the stressor without making any apparent attempts to escape. Okay? This then became used by, I guess the zeitgeist was just right, as a model for depression. And they suggested that when we encounter stressors, helplessness, and they're uncontrollable, helplessness evolves, and this helplessness then leads to depression. Okay? When I read this report, a number of things struck me, basically because of my background. But the first thing that struck me was, in this test, okay, you're exposing a dog, in this case, to a stressor over a 1-hour period. About 60 little stressors, each lasting about a half a second. And you have an animal then that shows complete passivity. It looks like it's resigned to its fate. Okay, what would happen if you had the very same thing, but not for 1 hour, but for 24 hours every day, day after day, for 5.5 years? What would you expect to happen? And for me, that was the analogy for what happens in a Holocaust situation. But when you think that one stress session could do what it did, imagine the ramifications of still greater stresses. But then another thing came back to me and said, okay, in their study, 80% of the animals showed this depressive-like behavior, but 20% didn't. What is it about those 20% that makes them resilient? How come some people, even with much greater stressors, survive the Holocaust, and not only survive the Holocaust, but do well in the future? They flourish. Now, there's no question that having been in the Holocaust, there's all sorts of pathologies that will arise later. I'll show you some data on this in a short while. But yet, the 20% survive. What makes one individual resilient and another individual very vulnerable? And by the way, vulnerability and resilience are not two ends of a continuum. Okay? They're more or less orthogonal. You can be vulnerable to all sorts of things. Okay? You can get very sick, but you can also be resilient and become better very quickly. Okay? So bad things happen to me, but if I have a good social group, if I'm really well connected, or if religion, for example, as we'll talk about, can be a very powerful coping mechanism, that can protect me from all the bad things to help me through them or to get rid of an illness that's already there. Not cancer, things like this, but certain types of conditions. Okay? So we start to look at what are the factors that can make an individual more or less resilient, and these are some of the many factors that can do this sort of thing. So, for example, there's genetic factors, personality variables, early experiences, being flexible in the way we deal with events as opposed to being very focused and narrow and transigent and doing things one way and never moving away from that. And sometimes there's a bit of luck. As I said to Aviva the other day, okay, sometimes it's better to be lucky than to be smart. Okay? Lots of smart people didn't get away from the Nazis. Lots of lucky people did. Okay? Now, when I look at the neurochemical systems associated with stressors, does this have a pointer? No? Okay. We don't need a pointer. Down here, a smart person would find it. A lucky person would find it. Okay, I'll use it in another way. Down here, okay, are they... What's that? Yeah. See? Okay, down here are a lot of biological systems that are affected by stressors. But whether or not those flexible systems do what they're supposed to do, whether they kick in at the right time, are controlled or moderated by a whole bunch of other types of variables. So, for example, the stressor characteristics. Is it controllable or uncontrollable? Is it a predictable one? Is it an unambiguous one that I can understand? Okay. Or it might be the case that the organismic variables, my age, my gender, my age is what I'm still thinking about, genetic factors and so forth can modify my stress response and hence my ability to either become vulnerable or resilient to various stress-related things. And the experiential variables are also very important. What happened to me early in life? And there's now a lot of papers that will suggest to you that if you encounter moderate stressors early in life, that's good. It makes you hardy. It makes you strong. It teaches you how to do the right things. Okay? However, if the situation is a toxic one, if the stressors themselves are toxic, economic problems, fights in the family, fights outside, lateral violence, and so forth, these do not help you. What they do instead is they make you much more vulnerable to later pathology. So the child who's brought up in this cruddy environment, when that child as an adult, many years later, encounters a further stressor, PTSD and depression are much more likely to ensue. Okay, so we've been looking at these many variables that do this sort of thing. When you encounter a stressor, something very simple happens. The first thing that you do is you make an appraisal of the stressor. You say, what's going on here? Okay. Once you make this appraisal, you say, okay, this is what's happening. I understand that this is a bad event. But shortly afterwards, you will make a second appraisal. And this appraisal is one of, do I have control over the situation or do I not? Can I handle it or not? And if the conclusion is you can't, okay, then you will engage in coping responses up there to try to get you out of this situation. And if those coping responses fail, stress responses, biological responses, and behavioral stress responses will ensue, which could lead to pathological outcomes. The appraisal itself is not simple. An event can occur, and you can see, so for example, you're being sent off to take some special course in something in computers, okay, something very hard, okay, or using a cell phone. Yeah. Okay. You might see it as a challenge, or you might see it as a chore. Okay. Say, wow, I'm going to get to use a cell phone. I can phone all my friends. I can do what other people do, like this, right? Or you can see it as, oh God, I got to take off 2 weeks. What a pain in the butt. Okay. Or you can also see it as cost or investment. This is going to cost me a fortune. I got to stay away from work and so forth. Or you can see it as an investment. Say, once I've got this done, I'll be able to use a computer. I'll be able to do that much more work. Somehow it doesn't feel right. Okay. But the brain doesn't like a vacuum. It likes certainty. And very often the stresses we're in are uncertain. Okay, will there be a terrorist attacks? What's with all these little green lights and blue lights? Okay, is there a cell in Canada here that might attack us? I'm very conscious now of saying things exactly right. I don't want to say about, or do we say about, or are we the abouts or the about? I'm not sure. So into your ears, I'm saying about. I'm saying about. Oh, I don't know. Okay, but I'm conscious that I'm doing something wrong. What's that?
You're getting very stressed.
Very. We'll talk about this. Okay. So basically, when a certain situation is ambiguous, it's uncertain, we don't know what to do with it, we make things up. Okay? We add little bits of information. Even, and this is very important, as you'll see later. You know, we don't like unconnected dots. We like things filled in. And if the data aren't there, we fill them in ourselves. Okay? I know some scientists. Okay. Okay, once we make the proper appraisals, we now have to go ahead and look at our coping responses. How do we cope with stressors? There's about 200 or 300 different stressors, but by and large, these can be broken down to this dozen or 13, 14, 15 types of stressful events, stressful coping events that we can use. Okay? Some of them are very straightforward, you know about them, so problem solving, obviously, cognitive restructuring, seeing the way in a different world, so it can come in a minor situation. So, for example, I like to tell people, one example of cognitive restructuring is my kid failed out of university. Hey, but I save on the salary, on the tuition. Okay? My kid isn't in here, so it's okay, I can say these things. But on bigger things, okay, an example of cognitive restructuring is finding meaning. Okay, so a woman, for example, loses her child to a drunk driver, and what she does is that creates an organization like MAD, okay, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. She's finding some way to cope with her loss, okay, by creating something good, and we see this all of the time. Okay, there's basically characteristics of a problem or coping styles of a problem-solving nature, and those of an emotional type of coping strategy. And you will sometimes hear people say the problem focus is good, the emotion focus is bad. It's absolutely incorrect. Each strategy is different. Each strategy is used under different situations. And sometimes when you emote, when you do emotional expression, you're sending a message to other people saying, I'm in real trouble, come and help me. Whereas if you problem solve it all on your own, you may get no help. So depending on the situation, but much more important, I guess, is that we need to be flexible in our coping strategy. So this doesn't work, move to this. And if this doesn't work, move to that. Okay? Instead, what most people do, they will focus on the same thing. The computer broke down, try this, try it again, try it again, try it again. Then they resort to punch the computer. Okay? It has a lot of satisfaction, but it doesn't fix this computer at all. Okay? There's two others, social support seeking, having friends, has many, many functions, and religion or culture is also very important as a coping mechanism. When we do our studies in university students, religion comes out like 0. Okay? No great surprise when you're 21, they're not thinking about religion. When you're 68, when you're 75, you know that thing about there's no atheists in the foxholes. The same thing appears here. Religion becomes more important as you grow older. Okay? But the religion needn't be in form of a god or something like this. The religion could be a pantheistic type of thing, or it could be a culture. Okay? This is my group, this is my culture, and in that case, it often goes together with a social support. Religion doesn't only have the God component to it. Religion also means when I go to my synagogue or my church or my mosque, I've got a bunch of friends. They're my group. Okay? And so the two often get interwoven. Okay, so it's often very hard to separate them. Okay, social support is used in multiple varieties. They're very important. It's a shoulder to cry on, somebody to help me get to the hospital, somebody to loan me money, take care of my kids, on and on and on. So there's many functions of social support, but it cuts both ways. When a kid is working on a problem and the parent says, look, let me help you. No, Dad, I want to do it myself. We like our independence, okay? The same thing when you always come to my rescue, okay? I feel, I haven't got my independence, and when you help me, I owe you. And I don't like to owe you. I want to be independent, and I don't want any strings, so I'd like to do it myself. But the other thing that happens with support is that sometimes it's legitimate. You should be going to friends for support. And it's reasonable for you to expect that support will be there. You've supported the other person, now they should support you. but often they don't. Okay? We have some terrible examples of this unsupport, but on the day-to-day basis, it might be, we talked about minimizing, bumbling, distancing, blame, and confrontation. So blame is, I told you so. Minimizing is when somebody says, I have a tumor, don't worry, you'll get better. Oh, that was helpful. You know. Bumbling, when they don't know what to say. And they say, oh, well, you know, maybe, and they walk away. Distancing is the same thing where they pretend they don't see you, but you know they saw you, and it's dismaying, okay? One of the worst is confrontation, okay? When you go to your friend and you have some issue, and they say to you, well, you know, there's two sides to every story. Okay? No, there's not two sides to every story. There's the one side, it's my side, and if you're my friend, you'll be on that side. And if I wanted a lecture, I'd go to somebody else, okay? Anyway, but one of my research assistants came to me not long ago. I shouldn't go on these sidetracks. I'm already not going to make it, but just for this one thing. A research assistant came to me a while ago, and she says she and her boyfriend had a huge fight. And she says, he's such a jerk. He's just so single-minded. He had come home. He had a huge fight with his boss. His boss, he said, was totally unreasonable and told him to do this, this, and this. And he says, what do you think I should do? She said, well, first, before we talk about that, she says, there's two sides to every story. Maybe you should see his side. Okay. So he stormed out. I don't know why he did that. Okay. Yeah, it's like, okay. Sometimes the unsupport is at a personal level, but sometimes the unsupport is at a collective level. Okay. We know this, for example, when the Jews were trying to come to Canada and their ships were turned away. Now, Canada didn't owe the Jews anything at all, but it was reasonable, I think, to expect that you won't send them back to what was going on in Germany. But in other conditions, we have reasonable expectations of support. And the consequences, Martin Luther King's comment and Elie Wiesel's comment, to remain silent in the difference is the greatest sin of all. And you heard yesterday, don't sit on the fence. You're helping the persecutor, not the victim. Okay, the victimizer is being helped. And this comment by Martin Luther King, in the end we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. That speaks volumes for me. Okay, I had an expectation, you weren't there, don't come to me in the future. Okay, but of course they always do, and you always give in. Okay, let's move on to yet another aspect of stress, and that it causes, as I mentioned before, many, many neurochemical changes. These are adaptive changes. I really need this sip, sorry. When you're stressed, a series of neurochemical changes occur in the brain and in the body that help you deal with the stressor. They can do things such as blunt the impact of the stressor. So, for example, when my CRH levels, particular hormone, go up, I will feel in certain brain regions, I might feel less of the stressor for the moment. You often get feelings of guilt that are associated with this because when you feel less, you think to yourself, I should have felt more. Dad died, and I thought I should have felt much worse. But I don't. Okay? Well, your brain is doing something very special, and you're very lucky. It's saying, little at a time. I will come along and allow more CRH to function so that you will feel more guilty. But all at once, it's too hard. Okay? There are other neurochemical changes that, for example, immune changes. If the stressor is mild, it'll activate the immune system to fight off that predator that might be after you. Okay? You can get a series of other changes. So, for example, over there you see something called BDNF. It helps your learning ability. It creates a plasticity in neurons so that what you're able to do is learn about the events, know how to deal with it, and it strengthens the synaptic connections in your brain. This BDNF turns out to be one of the most important things we have available to us in dealing with stresses, but I'll come back to that near the end if we have some time. Ordinarily, these stressors go on for a pretty long time, and they're very functionally effective in the sense that they work together and they get rid of or help you get rid of some pathological state. One way or another, they help you get away. But sometimes the stress goes on for too long. Stress is here. You're trying to cope biologically. You're trying to cope behaviorally. And that teeter-totter, which is normally balanced very well, now starts to go this way. We refer to this as allostatic load. The system simply can't handle it. And the allostatic load occurs most often when the stress is uncontrollable, is unpredictable, ambiguous, creates uncertainty, and occurs on a chronic basis. Okay? You can see that as the combination of stressful events that are really ugly. This is the type of thing that you would see in a concentration camp, okay, in a prison, in a child who's being brought up in this horrible, horrible, horrible toxic environment. It's like some of the Aboriginal kids were brought up in. It's under these conditions that your coping systems totally fail you. The stress coping balance breaks apart, and vulnerability to illness increases. So, for example, under these situations, you will see two types of pathology, or in a broad scale. There's one type of pathology occurs because you've utilized your resources. They're depleted. There's not enough left. A second type is because of what's referred to as secondary damage. A particular hormone is released from my body under stress situations. It's terrific. It helps me a lot. But it eventually gets to the brain, and if it's there day after day after day, it will cause damage to cells in the brain. And as a result, symptoms such as Alzheimer's will eventually develop. Not tomorrow, but the dementias and things of this nature will develop because it's essentially destroying a brain region called the hippocampus. Okay? The point for us is that this allostatic load is very bad. So I told you to this point is stress leads to appraisals and behavioral coping, biological coping, allostatic overload, and pathology. What I haven't told you is that the effects of stressors are not transient. They're very long-lasting. Okay? That is, the stress can happen and it seems to go away. Okay? Everything's fine and good, but it's not. You may not remember that stressor, but your neurons do. Okay? Whether you were stressed as a child, whether you were stressed prenatally, okay, you don't know that you've been stressed, but those neurons have changed. Okay? The receptors have taken on characteristics that are now very, very much altered, so that if later, as a child or as an adult, you encounter a future stressor, all of the pathology that could occur will occur again, but much more quickly. Okay? So neurons have memories. Never mind that your brain has memories, but the actual neurons themselves have memories, so that we refer to this as sensitization, so that it will have consequences far down the road. Now, we first discovered this in 1979. It became a one-hit wonder in a sense, because one hit, there was nothing for me to really follow, because there were all these giant labs that had all the equipment that I didn't have, so they were able to do it a lot faster. But I get all the credit for the original stuff, so that's okay. We have actually, I'm just kidding, we have actually followed up, not as quickly as other labs could, but we have. And what we see is that it's not just stress to the same stressor. If I'm badly stressed today, I may show a response to a different stressor some other day, okay? Months or years later. Not only that, if I'm stressed today, the probability of becoming a cocaine or amphetamine addict down the road is also increased because they share common neurochemical processes. Likewise, if I'm a cocaine addict, the probability of me showing stress-related pathology down the road when I encounter a stressor is also increased. It's a two-way sensitization. Okay? And what you will find is that there may be intergenerational effects, because when you get stressed, it's not just my hormones that are changed, it's the DNA. And I'll be showing you this later. The DNA itself can be changed. Okay? By this I mean that the DNA strand itself is exactly the way it was before, but there are little blockers in place, for all intents, that don't allow that DNA or the genes that are on that DNA to express themselves. Okay? This is referred to as an epigenetic effect. But what happens now is I can pass on this DNA strand to my kid. This kid, my kid, has never experienced a stressor, but his genes, his chromosomes, are as if they have been. So if I'm a Holocaust survivor and my genes have changed, I will pass on these same genes to my kid. And I'll show you that later. As I mentioned to you before, these types of events, okay, these traumatic events, can be developed even if you experience a stressor prenatally or in early postnatal development. And by the way, one of my graduate students, Shlomo Jacobson, who's home with a sick kid today, has also demonstrated that the juvenile period, adolescence, is particularly prone to this. Adolescence is a time where kids are trying to socialize, they're breaking away from their parents, they're being a little bit more independent and so forth. They hit a stressor at this point, and now they become particularly vulnerable to adult disturbances. Freud had this one comment. Nobody reads Freud anymore, although he was really terrific. But traumatic memory represents a causative agent still at work. And I love that quote because it's telling you that the stress that happened didn't just go away. It's there. It's still doing all sorts of horrible stuff. Most of our work has dealt with two things. Depression is one of them. And as I was particularly interested in students, I've just given you a few numbers here of the frequency of depression that occurs in students, much higher than anybody expected. And a number of years ago, I was giving a talk, I think Aviva was the dean at the time, where I said to this group, when these students come in, we treat them as if they're adults. They want to be adults. When in fact they're adults, well, in adult clothing, they're little kids. You only have to see them on prom night at the end of first year. Okay, you think, these aren't adults. These are the same, it's like grade 12 graduation or something of this nature. Anyway, but about 5% of males and 12% of females become depressed. The depression is very severe often. And what makes it worse is associated with stigma and shame. They don't tell about it. And very few go to seek treatment, which compounds it still more. And the original impetus for all this was a stressor. The stressor might be any different stressor, schoolwork, finances, leaving home, leaving a secure place, and so forth. The other thing we look at a lot is post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, you've all heard about it, it affects soldiers and so forth. And you have the image that if you're in a war zone or if a terrible accident happens, you'll develop post-traumatic stress disorder. The new DSM-5 criteria, however, suggests that that's too simple. The DSM-5 is the diagnostic and statistical manual that's used by psychiatrists. And it's now been changed so that if you look at the blue, trauma experiences can also compromise learning of trauma experienced by a close friend, relative, or repeated exposure to details regarding a traumatic event. And then goes on to say, or exposure that occurs through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures. Okay. If those types of events can cause PTSD, as it did after 9/11, hearing about your parents' experiences, either directly or indirectly, with language or without language, if you hear those experiences, okay, as a child, and given the vulnerability of the child, is there any wonder that the second generation is going to have the same effects? Okay? It may be neurochemical, it may not be neurochemical, it may be a combination of both, but it's going to happen in all likelihood. Now, the talk you heard this morning, there were a number of quotes from Marion Hirsch, and I said, okay, she's going to use the quote I wanted to use, but you didn't. Okay, but this is actually my favorite. She defines post-memory here as the relationship of children of survivors of cultural or collective trauma to the experiences of their parents, experiences that they remember only as narratives and images which they grew up, but are so powerful, so monumental, as to constitute memories in their own right. Okay? You'll hear these stories enough, or not hear them, it's sense them, I guess, okay, or feel them. Okay? If you encounter these experiences enough, you accept them as your own. You know they're not yours, but you do accept them as your own, and they affect you that way. Okay? My Father Bleeds History. That's what struck me about the title of Art Spiegelman's book. Okay? He's bleeding history. It's such a powerful emotion. I didn't much care for the rest of the book. The little mice turned me off. Okay? Working with mice, it's like... Anyway. But it's that one statement about my father bleeds history. It really struck a note, okay? I can remember my own father bleeding history in his quiet way, but bleeding nonetheless. Okay? And there's a wonderful book by Eva Hoffman, After Such Knowledge. Ironically, as she points out in the book, she borrowed the title from what's his name? I always put a little mental block in there. Proof rock guy. Elliot, thank you. The proof rock. See, when you don't like somebody, you block. Okay, so how does a guy? Like you always wonder. And you mentioned this earlier. How does a guy so yucky write such good poetry? It's like I don't get it. Anyway, but it's this type of work that's come along that's pushed me a little bit further to look at the collective trauma, and what you see all of the time is an increase in the incidence of PTSD, but it's not just in the Holocaust survivors, of course. Any group that's gone through this sort of thing will show you the same type of thing. Now, it's important to say something here. I'm going to be shortly talking about the Indian residential schools. And when I mention the Japanese Americans and their intergenerational effects and the Turkish genocide of Armenians, you know the one that didn't happen according to the Turks? Okay. Or maybe it's only 4 people. Anyway, I can't help myself sometimes, I'm sorry. When we look at these different types of things, we're not trying to make an equation between them. We're not saying what happened to Aboriginals is the same thing that happened to Holocaust survivors. The situations were entirely different. At the end of the day, bad things happened, and I guess when you look at the field at night, all the cows look the same. Okay? And to the person who's had the experience, they're not looking, oh, you had the Holocaust, now I'm in a First Nations bad place. Okay? It's unimportant. So we're not trying to make a comparison. We're not trying to make an equation. What we're simply saying is that this situation can teach us something about this situation, and vice versa. So for me, the fundamental questions now are, what factors promote or exacerbate second-generation effects? Okay. What is it about an individual early life experience that can make, for example, that can make things worse? And conversely, what makes some individuals resilient? You heard these people yesterday talking about their resilience. What made them that way? Was it luck, or was it something biological, something cognitive, something religious, and so forth? All of these. Okay? What are the mechanisms, what are the biological processes and the behavioral processes that allow for this to happen? And finally, once we figure that out, what do we do about it? Now, there's no need to read all of this. I only put it up to point out that there's a lot of what IRS stands for Indian residential schools. Okay, I'll come to that in a minute. There's a lot of ways in which trauma, such as the Indian residential schools, could affect individuals. It could affect them by just being a toxic stressor, or it could destroy their identity. It can create poor nutrition, poor growth, and so forth. Okay? So I'm just telling you that there's very many reasons, including at the bottom, these biological processes. Now, I told you before about this sensitization. This thing is broken. About sensitization. If you experience a trauma at one time, you will be very sensitive to a trauma at a later time. Okay? Cues, so if I take a mouse, for example, and I expose it to some sort of stressor, put it back in its cage for a few months, and now, as you know, just expose it to cues associated with that stressor, all of the same neurochemical changes will occur. Same thing is true of a drug addict. Okay? I expose him to, he's quit drinking or he's quit his amphetamine use. We simply need to bring him back to the environment. Not a drink, just the environment. And he's going to start craving. Okay? He's going to want that drug, and he's going to eventually break down because other systems involved with serotonin, for example, might be diminished, and so he can't control his impulsivity. So you have the craving on the one side, the impulsivity on the other, and then the final product here is obvious. Okay? For people who've been experiencing, who had experienced a major trauma, what you find is that cues associated with the event cause a re-traumatization, exactly as I described to you with respect to sensitization. Okay? There can be many types of events that cause these re-traumatizations. Sometimes we don't see them. So I can remember my mother, for example, everything's fine, and all of a sudden, click, you can see her stare out into vacant space. Okay? And for her, the worst thing was the Sabbath candles, okay? Which caused her to break down every Friday night as she did her Sabbath blessings. Okay? These were the reminder stimuli that caused her grief to become that much greater. For most of us, what also happens is discrimination in and of itself is a horrible, yucky, I can't find the words, behavior that people engage in. Okay? But for the Holocaust survivor, it's more than that. It's a reminder of what happened to them before. Okay? So whether you're a Holocaust survivor or a kid who was brought up in an Indian residential school, being called those names that go with discrimination or being treated in that yucky way will reactivate those same biological processes, those same bad behavioral processes, and ultimately what you will see is a reintroduction of the pathology. Now, when we're exposed to a discrimination, and this is what we follow a lot in various types of people, there are two major emotions that are elicited. There are many emotions, of course, but there are two major ones. One is shame, and the other is anger. In the case of shame, you've just read Milan Kundera's expression here. I would read it out loud to you, but I get to that word ignominy, and I fail. And so you have to read it yourself. I'd be absolutely serious. But the second quote from one of our participants in one of our studies really rang a note. She says, "Today, I'm so ashamed of the shame I experienced as a child, and I'm so angry that my parents never taught me to be proud of who I was." Okay? Her parents had both been in a residential school. Okay? They came back being ashamed of who they were. Their culture was knocked out of them. The language was knocked out of them. Their community was gone. When they sent a kid off to school, okay, they made fun of the other kids who were kids of residential school survivors, okay, telling this kid, don't be one of them. Okay, you're a different group, right? And as she became older, this was a shame she carried with her. And now she was ashamed of having been ashamed. And it's a very, very powerful emotion. When we looked at the relationship between various types of trauma and various types of illnesses, what we found was something very interesting. Car accidents, a shocking experience, a car accident, was associated with trauma. Trauma here is like PTSD, but it's a broader scale. We'll call it just trauma. Okay? They weren't depressed, and they weren't anxious. Okay? Death of a loved one, none of the trauma, a little bit of depression, and no anxiety. Most of us don't get severely depressed at the death of a loved one. It's something we expect. It bugs us for a while, we think about it, but clinically it's not a depression. It goes away. Okay? Trauma to others is quite powerful. Okay? Close others, people that you know, and you can see the numbers are higher. Assault, being personally assaulted, you get some very high scores. So a personal assault, which is directed at you as an individual, as opposed to a car accident, you may be more hurt in a car accident, but it's this personal assault that has the greatest effects on all three pathologies. And look at discrimination. This is discrimination that's caused you to feel emotions of fear, helplessness, and horror. So it's a dangerous type of discrimination. It's much stronger than most of the others. Okay? You have correlations of 0.21, 0.31, and 0.28. The number of participants, for what it's worth, are several hundred in overall. And the n's you can see on the side. It's a small n, so it doesn't mean all that much, but we've since seen similar types of effects. What was also very interesting to me is something else. When we looked at the correlations between anger and shame, what people wanted to do about it, and what their neuroendocrine stress responses were like. If you showed a response of anger, if you look here, you have a negative 0.47. Okay? What this means is, I don't accept this. Okay? So it's a lack of acceptance. I want to take individual actions. I want to do something about this. I'm not just going to sit by. And I want collective action. Those things with the stars are statistically significant. My group as a whole, I and my group need to do something. If, on the other hand, they showed shame, their acceptance was negative. They didn't accept it, but not nearly as strongly as the case of anger. But the individual action and the collective action weren't there. They weren't going to do something. But if you look at the cortisol levels down at the bottom, it's highly significant, unlike what you see in the other group. Cortisol is a stress hormone. That is, when you're stressed, that cortisol goes up and is going to help you do things. But it does tell us that stress is present. So essentially, what you find is that the shame doesn't lead to individual actions, and instead it morphs into resignation, passivity, there's nothing I can do. It goes to that helplessness we talked about earlier. Okay? In contrast, the anger gets you out there, it gets you doing something, and this is, these are data from Aboriginal groups, and it's basically saying, I'm not going to let this go on. And when we hear the Aboriginal groups say, never again, they mean it exactly the same way we do. In their case, they're blocking traffic. We should just put up with it, like it or not. They need to express themselves because they've been dealing with the same types of issues that we have. They're now at the point of saying, enough. Okay? Now, we have different types of discrimination. Some discriminations are overt. Okay? And some discriminations are mild. The discriminations that are mild are microaggressions. We see a lot more of it now than we did years ago because of a political correctness. So nobody says to me these days, dirty Jew. Okay, my neighbor a number of years ago did because I was mowing my lawn on a Sunday. I quit mowing, okay, if that's what it's going to take. Okay, anyway, but you have other things happening. Like when the Jenin massacre occurred, and somebody comes into your office, one of your colleagues, and says, your people are disgusting. My people? They're Israelis. Okay, I'm Jewish. What's the my people here? Okay, but you have these minor things. Okay, we refer to them as microaggressions, and they have great impact, particularly in an environment where there's so much so much difficulty just separating politics from other things. You see how I got out of that? Okay. Now, there's no question, okay, that not everybody who's anti-Zionist is anti-Semite. Okay? An anti-Semite, however, is going to be an anti-Semite. I switched to Yiddish. An anti-Semite, however, invariably is going to be an anti-Zionist. That's just the way it's going to work. So be clear about the two. Our trick on a day-to-day basis is trying to figure out when is it anti-Semitism and when is it anti-Zionism. Okay? And this isn't easy to do. But I have a whole bunch of quotes. I won't put them up now. A whole bunch of quotes, one after another, and then the justification for it at the end. You go, no, you will all agree, that's anti-Semitism. Okay? And no, I used the word Jew, but it really meant Zionist. Okay. Now, sometimes you just get to feel that line. Did I fall off a turnip truck somewhere near Chelm? Okay. Chelm is a small town in Poland. It's sort of like, it's not nice, but it's sort of like when we used to tell Newfie jokes. Chelm was Newfie, Newfoundland. Okay. So you understand what it means. Now, I want to take a break for a minute if I could figure out, guys, how to play this. Okay. This is about minor aggressions, microaggressions.
In New York City, please give it up for Vanessa Heddery.
I meet a guy in a bar that's cute. He wears LL Bean duck boots and guards my bar stool when I have to go pee. He asked me out to dinner for the following Tuesday. I decline. Tuesday is Yom Kippur. I will be fasting. You're Jewish? Wow. You don't look Jewish. You don't act Jewish. And he says it in this tone that sounds like he's complimenting me. And I say nothing. I say nothing, which combined with a flirty smile translates to thank you. I say nothing because I got a contact high of someone's anti-Semitic crack pipe. I say nothing because somewhere along my life's graph, I've been swayed to believe that being Jewish is not too cool, not too sexy. I say nothing because I'm in a deep sleep, a snow-white coma, destined to meet my prince 5 years later in the form of stone in Jerusalem named the Wailing Wall. I place folded paper with written prayers for the dead in a nook in the wall next to a woman with concentration camp numbers tattooed on her forearm. Surrounded by fervent praying and bodies swaying, I am far more awake than I ever thought possible. I suddenly remember the exodus of the Israelites, and I walk barefoot from the wall in the desert to the bar and look for the guy with the duck boots. He's not there, but I have something to say to him. He's not there, so I make a soapbox and reenact the scene. Bartender, tell me I don't look Jewish. Tell me I don't act Jewish. Because I'm saying, what does Jewish look like to you? Should I fiddle on a fucking roof for you? Should I humor you with oy veys and refuse to pay? Oh, because you know how we like to Jew you down. Jew you down, I'd like to throw you down. Because I walked here long miles on hot sand to publicly repent my sins because I almost forgot. 6 million died without having the option of giggling on bar stools. Almost forgot that concentration camp survivors are now a dying generation. That my children may never have the sensation of seeing in person. And if you must see me as that blood-sucking Jew, see me as that pesky mosquito that bites and sucks the prejudice right out of you. Just feel the need to say I can't be the only exception to the rule. Just the one right now using my poetry as a tool. To follow KRS-One, I will use my gift to only uplift and maybe change just one heart tonight. I'm the Hebrew Mamita, long-lost daughter of Abraham and Sarah, the sexy oy vey and chutzpah-having, non-cheaping, non-conspiracizing, always questioning, hip-hop listening, Torah scroll reading, all people loving, pride-filled Jewish girl. Bigging up all people who are a little miffed because someone tells you you don't look like or act like your people. Impossible, because you are your people. You just tell them they don't look, period.
Only a dummy would do that. Deirdre just told me I've gone over time, and JJ, our next speaker, has to fly out because he's got to go to one of his fancy places, God knows where. No, I'll make it very fast. Okay, just no. I'll wrap up, but thank you. The Indian residential schools started in 1863. They didn't end until 1996. Children were taken from families and communities across Canada with the idea of taking the Indian out of the Indian. Okay? This was essentially the Indian was bad. While they were in these residential schools, they suffered all sorts of tragedies. Never mind the abuse you hear and all of these things. There's much more to it than that. There was not just abuse from the school teachers and whatever these people were. There was also lateral abuse, child-on-child abuse, which isn't popular, but it happens, and there's reasons for it happening, and you will see it regardless of where you look. Whatever orphanage, whatever place where kids are put together, this happens, especially when they're following the lead of what the adults do. Okay? But what's taken here is much more from them, is much more than just that. That's their dignity, which is, of course, important, but they're also losing their language, they're losing their culture, and so forth. We looked, as part of the National Regional Longitudinal Health Survey, Amy Bombay, Kim Mathis, and I looked at 2 versus 3 years, kids who were in these schools for 2 versus 3+ years, and asked them the question of which of the following most affected you. And you can see that the lack of proper clothing, things like this, were very low on the hierarchy. The red lines show you the 3 years plus, the blue 2 years plus, and you can see in virtually every case, okay, each of these events caused massive trauma, if you will, for these kids. When we looked at these kids' childhood experiences, because what often happens is stress breeds stress, okay? And what you found is the kids who had no parent, these are now the next generation. If they had no parent in the IRS versus having a parent, they encountered greater childhood stressor experience later on, and as adults, they encountered more stressors. What you also find is that their depression scores were higher. These people who have no parented residential school or have low depression, they have much higher depression. And this depression is still higher if you compare these two, if as adults they encounter a further trauma. So the original trauma, the residential school, put them into a state of depression or vulnerable to depression. If they encountered an adult trauma, you have that sensitization so that it took it to the next level. Whoa. You'll see the same thing here with respect to adverse childhood experiences and depressive symptoms as a function of one parent or no parent in residential school. Over here, these are the kids who have either no parent or one parent in residential school, but they don't encounter adverse childhood experiences. If they do encounter these experiences, things go worse for them as adults, but particularly so if their parent had been in residential school. You see that difference. The same thing happens here with respect to the number of traumas they encountered. The missing slide dealt with depressive symptoms related to discrimination, that as the reminder cue. The lowest slide, these are healthy controls, and these are cancer patients, and we're looking at their depression levels. You can see slight increase among women with breast cancer, slight increase in depression. But if they were Holocaust survivors, things are very different. The Holocaust survivors are, to start with, more depressed. If they also encounter the breast cancer, it increases much, much more. A previous stressor, okay, coupled with the disease today and that sort of thing, gives you a multiplicative effect. I'll skip this for now. Here, this is just to point out, if you have one parent in an IRS, an Indian residential school, versus 2 parents, depression rates are higher. And if you had both your grandparents and your parents, it'll be higher still. Now, not everybody who encounters these events will show these symptoms. It depends on their identity. Identity has 3 components: centrality, how important is it to me, the affect, or how much pride do I have in my group, and my in-group ties, my friends. When we looked at these factors, what we found was if it's important to you, and somebody discriminates against you, that's up there, you're likely to become depressed. Okay? It's central, it's important, of course it'll affect me more. But if I have great pride in my group, if I have pride in my culture, that same insult won't affect me. And that's this line here. So having great pride is great, and having close in-group ties is great as well. So if you have centrality, it's important to you, but you don't really have pride, and you don't really have in-group ties, you're going to be in trouble. Unsupport is something we talked about before, and I'll just tell you from this slide, we don't have to read it. If you encounter unsupportive relationships, in this case, these are second-generation kids, they will show much higher levels of depression, much higher levels of believing that they're being discriminated against, and so forth. So we have a second-generation effect. And what do I mean about unsupport? This type of response. This is a response. We did a study with the apology that the Canadian government gave to Aboriginal peoples who, in general, but when we first looked at it, the response of the people was very good. They said, the white people, the non-Aboriginal people, that's great. I think they did a really good thing. And the Aboriginal people said, well, we'll see. Talk is cheap. When we went back to them about a year later, okay, I'm going now. She's got this hook. Okay, when we went back about a year later, the responses we got from the white people is they got their apology. Now what the hell else do they want? He said I could talk.
He's very polite.
Okay, I'll finish off with 2 slides. JJ, tell her. We're old friends. Okay, most homes, the parents either talked about the Holocaust or they didn't talk about the Holocaust. Language was a big deal. And it leaves an ambiguity. Like, what the hell is going on here? You knew when, back off. Now's not the time to ask for ice cream. Okay? Or now's not the time to say, I want to go to Belmont Park, which is the thing in Montreal. Just be quiet. Okay? There's dynamic going on. But you didn't understand it. You were a little kid. Okay? Other times, you heard things that were related to the Holocaust, but again, you may or may not have understood what was going on. There are other parents who were very direct with their kids. And as Eva Hoffman says, a few survivors were determined never to talk about what they had lived through, but others wanted to give expression to the horror, or perhaps couldn't help doing so, to their immediate intimates, to spouses and siblings, and yes, to their children. There, they spoke in the language of family, a form of expression that's both more direct and more ruthless than social and public speech. We did a study with Aboriginal kids who experienced one type of communication or another. But what was very interesting is this. If the parents spoke to them about it, parents talked about what happened, their experiences. When you looked at the kids, they were not perfectly fine, but they were relatively fine. Depression didn't increase. If, however, there was nonverbal communication about the experiences, then it affected their centrality, affected their in-group affect, and led to depression. It's a correlation, not causal, but it's pretty strong nonetheless. When the parental attendance affected the kids through an indirect communication, they would see the parents cry, or they'd see something of this nature happen, that too led to depression. The indirect communication isn't all that surprising to me. That's what we really would have expected. But to see that the verbal communication having a protective effect was a very, very powerful thing. And it tells us something, the topic is about memory. Having the memory, explicit, is good for us. But having the memory very vague is not all that good for us. It creates an ambiguity, and as I told you before, we fill in the blanks. Whatever bad thing happened, we can make it worse in our minds. And finally, it's over. I told you about this, I'll skip this. I just wanted this one quote. The guardianship of the Holocaust is being passed on to us. The second generation is the Hymie generation, in which received, transferred knowledge of events is being transmitted into history or into myth. It is also the generation in which we can think about certain questions arising from the Shoah with the sense of a living connection. I think this is a very powerful statement. What I wonder about is what we heard yesterday. What about the third and the fourth generation? What are they going to get? And finally, I have many people who I worked with, Zul Morelli at the Royal Ottawa Hospital, Kim Matheson, Sean Haley, Aaron Vinden, Mike Potter, Lee Sheng-Du, and Larry Kokanais were the people I was most in touch with and doing the research in general. My work has been supported by those agencies down at the bottom. And my pride and joy is this group here. These are my graduate students from a few years ago. There have been many others over the years. But they're the ones to do all the hard work. I sit there in luxury and drink my coffee. They do all the work, then come to me, and I'm the big hero. Okay. But for these projects that I've just described, Opal McInnes, that's her, Robin McQuaid, Rob Gabry, Sheena Taha, Andrina Pierre, Mickey Talebi, and especially Amy Bombay collect all the data. Okay, thank you very much.